Hey there, and welcome to Drowsy History. If this is your first time here, welcome. I'm so glad you found your way to this quiet little corner of the internet where the lights are low, the pace is slow, and the history is long. Before we begin tonight, if you enjoy these kinds of long, slow historical journeys, I'd love it if you took just a moment to subscribe to the channel. It really does make a difference, and it means more stories like this one will find their way to you. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. It always means something to me to know that these slow stories are reaching people in the dark, all across the world, at all different hours of the night. Tonight, we are going somewhere that might surprise you. We are not going to a castle or a battlefield or an ancient tomb. We are not going to the banks of the Nile or the cobblestone streets of medieval London. Tonight, we are going somewhere louder, smokier, more perfumed, and in many ways far stranger than any of those places. We are going to the 1920s, and more specifically, we are going to spend this evening inside the life of one of the most iconic and misunderstood figures of the 20th century, the flapper. You probably have an image in your mind already. The short dress, the bobbed hair, the long string of pearls swinging as she dances, the cigarette in one hand and a glass of something illegal in the other, bright eyes, careless smile, the whole electric defiance of her. But the image, as always, is only the surface. Behind the image is a real human life, a life lived in a decade that felt, to the people inside it, like the rules of the entire world had been rewritten overnight. A decade when a generation of young women looked at everything their mothers had been told to be and decided, quite deliberately, to be something else. So get comfortable, make sure you're warm, let your shoulders drop a little, and your breathing slow down. If you drift off somewhere between the dance floor and the dressing room, between the speakeasy and the morning after, that is perfectly all right. That is exactly what this is for. There is no quiz at the end. There is no pressure to remember any of it. Just let the story carry you, soft and steady, all the way through the decade that changed everything. Let's begin. To understand the flapper, you first have to understand the world she was pushing against. Because she did not appear out of nowhere. She was not a spontaneous invention. She was a reaction, and the thing she was reacting against had been building pressure for generations. For most of the 19th century and into the early 20th, the dominant ideal for women in America and Britain was something historians sometimes call the cult of true womanhood. The phrase sounds almost satirical now, but it was deadly serious to the people who believed in it. A proper woman was defined by four virtues above all others: piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. She was the moral center of the home, the gentle guardian of the family's soul. She did not go out alone at night. She did not smoke or drink. She certainly did not dance with strange men in loud rooms. She wore her hair long, kept her ankles covered, and her ambitions, whatever they might secretly be, were understood to belong to her husband and her children and her God, not to herself. This was the world the flapper's mother had been handed. In many cases, it was the world her grandmother had been handed too, and for a long time, it had remained largely intact. But by the time the 20th century arrived, it was beginning to crack. The first pressure came from the suffrage movement, which had been grinding away at the edges of the old order for decades. Women had been marching, petitioning, going to jail, and fighting for the most basic of political rights, the right to vote. In the United States, that fight finally succeeded in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. In Britain, limited women's suffrage had been granted in 1918, with full equal suffrage following in 1928. These were enormous victories, but they were also symptoms of something even larger. A generation of women had learned through the suffrage struggle that they were capable of organized political action, that their voices mattered, that the old order was not actually immovable. The second pressure was the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, the war did something to the social fabric of Western civilization that no one had anticipated and no one could fully undo. Millions of young men left for the front. Someone had to fill the jobs they had vacated. And so women went to work in factories, in offices, in hospitals, in roles that had been considered unsuitable, even unthinkable for them just a few years before. They drove ambulances, they managed accounts, they operated machinery. They discovered, with something between surprise and fury, that they were perfectly capable of doing most of what had previously been considered men's work. When the war ended and the surviving men came home, there was an expectation that the old order would reassert itself. Women would go back to the kitchen. The factories would become male spaces again. The brief, strange interlude of female capability would be quietly folded away like a mistake nobody wanted to talk about. But the women who had lived through those years did not forget what they had learned about themselves. And then there was death. The war had killed on a scale that was almost incomprehensible, somewhere between 9 and 17 million people dead across all sides, and a further 50 to 100 million killed by the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919 that swept through the exhausted world in its wake. An entire generation of young men had been obliterated. The survivors, both male and female, emerged from those years with a relationship to mortality that was unlike anything their parents or grandparents had known. They had seen, in brutal, intimate detail, how quickly and randomly life could end. They had buried their friends and their brothers, and in many cases their entire sense of how the world was supposed to work. What you do with that knowledge, that the world can end and end and end again without much warning, is one of the defining questions of human psychology, and what a significant portion of the generation that survived the war did with that knowledge was decide to live, not to endure, not to wait, not to defer pleasure to some future that might never arrive, to live now, loudly, with their whole bodies. This is the soil from which the flapper grew. She was the daughter of exhaustion and grief and awakening all at the same time. She had watched the old order send a generation to die in the mud, and she was not inclined to take its rules about hemlines and hairstyles particularly seriously anymore. The decade she walked into, the 1920s, was unlike any decade that had come before it. Not everywhere, and not for everyone, There were still vast stretches of America where nothing much had changed, where the old pieties held firm, and young women still came home by 9 o'clock and prayed before bed. But in the cities, in Chicago and New York and London and Paris, something entirely new was under construction, and the flapper was both its architect and its most visible resident. Before we go any further, it is worth spending a few quiet minutes with the question of who the flapper actually was, because the image that has come down to us through a century of photographs and films and novels is a very specific one, and it does not tell the whole story. The flapper, as we typically imagine her, was young, usually somewhere between 16 and 25. She was urban. She was white. She was middle class or upper class, with enough money that she did not have to spend 6 days a week in a factory or a laundry. She had leisure time. She had disposable income. She had access to the department stores and the beauty parlors and the dance halls that made the flapper lifestyle possible. This is a real picture, as far as it goes, but it leaves out a great deal. The flapper phenomenon was, at its core, a consumer phenomenon as much as a social one. The 1920s were the decade when mass consumer culture in America came fully into its own. Department stores expanded. Mail order catalogs reached into the countryside. Advertising became a sophisticated industry unto itself, one that was learning with increasing skill how to convince ordinary people that they needed things they had never previously imagined needing: cosmetics, ready to wear fashion, recorded music, electric appliances, the automobile. All of these became mass market products in the 1920s, and all of them were sold in large part to women. The result was that the flapper aesthetic, the look, the attitude, the style, filtered outward from the wealthy urban elite far faster than anyone expected. A working class girl in Pittsburgh who could not afford a genuine Chanel dress could save up for a cheap copy from a department store. A small town girl in Kansas who had never been to a speakeasy could buy the same face powder and lipstick that a New York socialite was wearing, because both were now available at the five and dime. The flapper was originally an elite creation, but she became, to a remarkable degree, a democratic one. She was also, it is worth noting, often quite young. The word flapper itself had origins in British slang, where it had referred somewhat dismissively to a young woman just out of the schoolroom, an adolescent girl, barely finished with childhood, testing out the freedoms of adulthood. In America, the word arrived with slightly different connotations, but the youth remained central. Many flappers were teenagers. Many were girls who, in their mother's generation, would have been considered far too young for the freedoms they were claiming. Part of what made the flapper so alarming to the older generation was precisely this: that it was not just married women or women of established social position who were claiming these new freedoms. It was girls, young, barely adult girls, who seemed to have skipped entirely the period of modest, sheltered girlhood that previous generations had considered not just normal, but essential. African American women in the 1920s occupied a complicated relationship with the flapper phenomenon. On one hand, the same forces of urbanization, new employment, cultural liberation, and post war energy were reshaping black women's lives in profound ways during the decade that saw the Great Migration. the enormous movement of black Americans from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North, Harlem in New York, Bronzeville in Chicago. These neighborhoods were exploding with cultural vitality in the 1920s. Jazz, which was the foundational music of the flapper era, was a black American art form. The speakeasy culture that flappers inhabited was deeply intertwined with black musical performance and black entrepreneurship. And yet, the image of the flapper, as presented in mainstream white American culture, was almost exclusively white. Black women who dressed stylishly, who danced in jazz clubs, who cut their hair and wore cosmetics, were rarely included in the celebration of the new woman. The same freedoms that were being cheered as liberation when claimed by white women were often met with hostility or erasure when claimed by black women. The Harlem Renaissance, which was happening simultaneously with the flapper era, was producing its own extraordinary generation of women who were claiming new identities and new freedoms. Women like Bessie Smith, Josephine Baker, Zora Neale Hurston. Their stories belong alongside the story of the flapper, though they were rarely told alongside it at the time. There was also enormous geographic variation. The flapper, in her full ideal form, was a city creature. She needed the city. She needed its anonymity, the ability to reinvent yourself when no one knows your grandmother. She needed its density of commercial life, the stores, the salons, the clubs. She needed its critical mass of other young women doing the same thing, because there is safety and encouragement in numbers when you are doing something the culture considers improper. In small town America, particularly in the rural South and Midwest, the flapper was primarily a spectacle seen in magazines and movies, something that existed elsewhere in the strange, exciting, dangerous world of the cities. Some of her fashions and attitudes filtered in. Young women in small towns cut their hair and wore shorter skirts and read the same magazines. But the full immersive experience of flapper life, the late nights, the dancing, the relative freedom from constant social surveillance, was not really available outside the urban world. And within the cities themselves, class made an enormous difference. A wealthy socialite flapper had access to the most exclusive clubs, the best bootleggers, the finest clothes, and a social cushion that meant her family's disapproval could be absorbed without real consequences. A middle class secretary flapper had to be more careful. Her job could be threatened if her behavior became too scandalous, and her access to the high life was always partial, always mediated by how much she could afford. A working class girl who dressed like a flapper and tried to live like one-faced scrutiny and judgment that went well beyond what her wealthier counterparts encountered. All of this matters because the flapper is so often discussed as if she were a single type, a unified figure who can be summed up in a few images. She was not. She was a million individual women making individual decisions inside a moment of genuine cultural upheaval. Some of those decisions were triumphant, some of them were desperate, and all of them were more complicated than the photographs suggest. Let's talk about what she looked like, because the flapper's appearance was not merely aesthetic, it was a statement. Every choice she made about how to present her body to the world was, consciously or not, an act of negotiation with a century of rules about what women's bodies were supposed to look like and what they were supposed to mean. Start with the dress. The most immediately obvious thing about flapper fashion, the thing that scandalized editorialists and horrified pastors and sent mothers into long, weary arguments with their daughters, was the hemline. Victorian and Edwardian women had worn skirts that swept the floor. The hem had risen gradually in the years leading up to the 1920s, but by the mid decade, flapper skirts were landing somewhere between the knee and mid calf. On the boldest and most fashion forward women, they were actually above the knee. This was shocking in a way that requires some effort of imagination to fully recapture now. The female leg had been, for most of Western history, a hidden thing. Glimpsing an ankle was once considered mildly erotic. To see a knee was something genuinely transgressive. The flapper put her legs on display, not as an act of deliberate seduction necessarily, but as an assertion that her body was her own and she would dress it as she pleased. The silhouette was equally revolutionary. Victorian fashion had been built around the corset, a rigid, boned undergarment that reshaped the female torso into an exaggerated hourglass, tiny waist, pushed up bosom, flared hips. Women wore these things from early adolescence onward. They caused genuine physical damage, compressed organs, restricted breathing, permanently altered rib cages. They were, in the most literal sense, a cage made of fabric and bone that reshaped the female body to conform to male aesthetic preference. The flapper wore no corset, or rather, she replaced the hourglass enforcing corset with a flat bandeau that compressed the chest and de-emphasized curves. The ideal flapper silhouette was boyish, straight, flat. She did not want to look like the fertility goddess ideal of previous decades. She wanted to look angular, athletic, free-moving. She wanted a body that could dance, a body that could stride across a room without negotiating with its own clothing. This was, in its way, an extraordinary thing. For the first time in modern Western history, mainstream female fashion was not primarily organized around making women look sexually available to men in the traditional sense. The flapper's body was not offered up as a vessel of fertility or an object of domestic comfort. It was offered up as its own thing, quick and light and self-possessed. Then there was the hair. The bob. Oh, the bob. Cutting one's hair short, above the jaw, or even above the ears, was for a 19th century woman almost unthinkable. Long hair was a mark of femininity, of virtue, of properly inhabited womanhood. St. Paul had written that a woman's long hair was her glory. Victorian women spent enormous amounts of time and energy on their hair, washing it, oiling it, braiding it, pinning it up in elaborate arrangements. Hair so long that when it was let down, it fell past the waist, was considered beautiful, and it was almost always in public, pinned up and covered, private hair, hair that belonged to a woman's intimate domestic life. The flapper cut all of it off. The bob, in its various forms, the simple chin-length bob, the shorter shingle, the extreme Eton crop that was essentially a man's cut, swept through the cities in the early 1920s with remarkable speed, and the response was equally remarkable. Mothers wept, fathers raged, husbands threatened, ministers preached sermons against it, newspapers ran editorials, women who worked in offices were fired for cutting their hair. Colleges attempted to prohibit it. Some states discussed legislation. All of this over a haircut. But of course, it was not just a haircut. It was a dismantling of a century of symbolic labor. The long hair that had been woman's glory was also woman's obligation, her daily performance of a particular kind of femininity that the culture required of her. Cutting it off took at most half an hour. What it removed was years of work and a visible marker of compliance with an entire value system. The Bob said, among other things, "I am done maintaining this. I have other things to do." And then there was makeup. For a respectable woman of the Victorian era, cosmetics were associated with prostitution, theater, and moral degeneracy. A virtuous woman did not paint her face. She might use a little rice powder to reduce shine and call it that, powder, not cosmetics. But lipstick was for loose women, rouge was for actresses, mascara was unthinkable. A woman who wore obvious makeup was advertising, or so the cultural logic went, that she was available, that she was not under proper male protection, that she was, in some fundamental way, not quite a lady. The flapper put on lipstick in public and handed the tube to her friends. The cosmetics industry, which had existed but operated largely in the shadows, exploded in the 1920s. Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein were building their empires. Max Factor, who had started in theatrical makeup, pivoted to mass consumer cosmetics and essentially invented the modern concept of foundation. Advertisements began appearing everywhere in women's magazines, on billboards, in department stores, showing glamorous women in full makeup and implying unmistakably that you too could and should look like this. The flapper embraced all of it: the Cupid's bow lips painted in deep red, the coal darkened eyes, the heavily arched brows, the powdered face, often much paler than the natural skin tone, in a look that was consciously artificial, that said this is a constructed appearance, a chosen presentation, rather than the natural modesty that previous generations had been required to perform. She also touched up her makeup in public, at restaurant tables, in the backs of cars. This too caused scandal. The application of cosmetics had always been a private activity, something done in the bedroom, alone. To do it in public was to acknowledge that your appearance was constructed, that the female face was not naturally beautiful, but made beautiful through effort and art. This acknowledgement, which seems obvious and harmless to us now, was genuinely threatening to a culture that had built a great deal of ideology around the idea of natural female beauty as something modest and effortless. The clothes themselves were works of deliberate modernity. Rayon, introduced in the 1920s, allowed the cheap reproduction of silk-like fabrics. Sequins, beads, and fringe created the glittering, movement-responsive surfaces that looked so extraordinary on the dance floor. The dropped waist, characteristic of true flapper fashion, meant the dress hung straight from the shoulders, allowing freedom of movement that was quite simply impossible in previous silhouettes. You could not do the Charleston in a corset and a floor-length skirt. The clothes were made for the body in motion. Stockings shifted from heavy wool or cotton to the new silk and later rayon varieties. They were rolled down below the knee rather than held up with garters, which was another small, visible scandal. Rolled stockings left the knee visible. They suggested that the stocking's garter had been abandoned along with other forms of restraint, and shoes, the T-strap, the Mary Jane, the Cuban heel, dancing shoes for a dancing life. You cannot understand the flapper without understanding jazz, not just as background music, not just as the soundtrack playing in the rooms she inhabited. Jazz was the structural music of the flapper's inner life. It was the sonic form of everything she was reaching toward. Jazz was, by origin, a black American art form. It had grown out of New Orleans, out of the convergence of African rhythmic traditions, European harmonic structures, blues, ragtime, and the particular cultural world of a city that was unlike anywhere else in America. It had moved up the Mississippi to Chicago and St. Louis, and from there to New York, and eventually everywhere. By the early 1920s, it was the defining music of urban American nightlife. To the older generation, jazz was not just vulgar, it was dangerous. It was widely understood in a panic that combined genuine cultural anxiety with naked racism to be music that caused moral degeneration. The rhythms were considered animalistic. The improvisation was considered chaotic and undisciplined. The fact that it was black music being adopted enthusiastically by white young people was to many observers itself the evidence of its corrupting power. Newspaper editorialists wrote in the early 1920s about jazz causing nervous disorders. Religious leaders preached that jazz halls were doorways to sin. One Illinois Vigilance Association report claimed that jazz caused young people to experience a sort of intoxication that made them susceptible to immoral behavior. The flapper went to the jazz club anyway. What jazz gave her, what it gave everyone who opened themselves to it in those years, was several extraordinary things at once. It gave her a musical form organized around individual expression within collective structure, the soloist improvising over the ensemble, finding their own line through the harmonic material. This was, in miniature, exactly what the flapper was trying to do in her life: to improvise, to find her own line, to be an individual within but not entirely constrained by the collective. It gave her rhythm, the syncopation of jazz, those displaced accents and offbeat emphasis made it almost physically impossible to stand still. Jazz demanded a physical response. It demanded the body, and the flapper's body, finally freed from the corset, from the heavy skirts, from the architecture of Victorian femininity, was ready to respond, and it gave her the dance. The dances of the 1920s were unlike anything that had come before them in mainstream American culture. Social dancing had existed for centuries: waltzes, polkas, quadrilles. But those dances were partner dances with formal structures, governed by clear rules of body proximity and physical contact. You held your partner at a prescribed distance. You followed prescribed movements. You remained above all dignified. The dances of the 1920s abandoned all of this. The Charleston, which swept the country after appearing in the 1923 Broadway show Runnin' Wild, was a frenzy of swinging arms and crossing kicks. It was performed at high speed. It was physically demanding in a way that formal ballroom dancing was not. It required loose clothing. You could not do it in a corset, and it could be done alone or in a crowd without a partner, which was itself revolutionary. A woman dancing alone, moving her body for her own pleasure rather than as part of a paired ritual with a man, was a genuinely new social fact. The Black Bottom came after the Charleston, slightly wilder, involving pelvic movements that sent certain observers into genuine paroxysms. The shimmy, a vibration of the shoulders and torso was described in one period newspaper as a barbaric and lascivious exhibition. The Lindy Hop would arrive toward the end of the decade and into the 1930s, incorporating acrobatic lifts and throws that required extraordinary athletic skill. All of these dances shared certain characteristics. They were energetic, they were rhythmically complex, they required the whole body, not just the feet and the arms, but the hips, the shoulders, the torso. They involved physical contact between partners that would have been scandalous in the previous generation's ballrooms, and they were joyful in a way that was almost defiant. There is something in the photographs of women doing the Charleston, the wild athletic exuberance of those kicked legs, those swinging beads, that reads as a kind of political statement, even when it was just a girl having fun on a Friday night. The settings for this music and dancing were varied. Ballrooms were the grandest option, public dance halls of varying quality, from the gilded hotel ballroom where a society orchestra played to the rough-floored neighborhood dance hall where a smaller band played for working-class crowds. Then there were the cabarets, smaller, more intimate rooms where dinner was served alongside the dancing, and where the line between respectable entertainment and something more transgressive was deliberately blurry. And then there were the speakeasies. The speakeasy deserves its own section, and we will get to it. But here it is worth noting simply that the speakeasy was almost always a dancing place. You went to the speakeasy to drink, yes, but you also went to dance. The music in a good speakeasy was often extraordinary. The 1920s saw some of the greatest jazz musicians in American history playing in illegal basement rooms for crowds of young people who were, by the standards of their parents' world, doing everything wrong. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith. Their music filled those rooms, and the rooms filled with the sound, and the young people danced. The record player, the phonograph, brought all of this into the home as well. Recorded music had existed since the late 19th century, but the 1920s were the decade when it became genuinely mass market. Sales of phonograph records in the United States went from around 100 million units in 1920 to roughly 150 million by the middle of the decade. Jazz records, the original Dixieland Jazz Band, Mamie Smith, Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings, were selling in enormous numbers. A girl in her bedroom could put on a record and dance by herself or with her friends before going out. The music was everywhere. It was inescapable, and it was working on people continuously, softening the old certainties, making the body want to move. Radio amplified all of this even further. The first commercial radio station in America, KDKA in Pittsburgh, began broadcasting in 1920. By 1922, there were over 500 commercial radio stations. By 1923, millions of American homes had radio sets. And what radio broadcast to an enormous new audience of people who had never been to a jazz club was jazz. Music that had been confined to specific city neighborhoods was suddenly audible in farmhouses and sitting rooms across the country. The cultural earthquake of the 1920s had a soundtrack, and radio made sure that almost everyone could hear it. In January of 1920, the United States government, in its wisdom, banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution which had been ratified the previous year following decades of campaigning by the temperance movement, went into effect. The Volstead Act provided the mechanism for enforcement, and prohibition began. What followed was one of the most extraordinary social experiments in American history and one of its most spectacular failures. Within months of Prohibition's start, illegal production and distribution of alcohol was flourishing. Organized crime, which had existed before Prohibition, was transformed by it into something vastly more powerful and wealthy. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago built criminal empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars on the simple fact that Americans wanted to drink and someone had to supply them. The bootlegger, the person who transported illegal liquor, became a folk figure of the era. The speakeasy, the illegal bar, proliferated everywhere. In New York City at the peak of Prohibition, estimates suggested there were somewhere between 20 and 30,000 speakeasies operating, more than double the number of legal bars that had existed before the ban. They were everywhere, in basements, in back rooms, behind false walls in legitimate businesses, in hotel suites, in brownstones where the front parlor served as cover. The very ubiquity of them was part of their appeal. Finding a speakeasy, knowing the right knock or the right password, being admitted to the secret world behind the ordinary one, all of this had the thrill of transgression without, for most participants, very much actual risk. For the flapper, the speakeasy was enormously important, not just as a place to drink, though it was that, but as a social space that was organized around different rules than the ones that governed daylight life. Before Prohibition, the saloon had been an almost exclusively male space. Women of any respectability simply did not go to bars. A woman who drank publicly was a woman of low character. This was so deeply embedded in the culture that the temperance movement had actually recruited many women by framing prohibition as a feminist cause, as a way to protect women and families from the destructive effects of male drinking. The speakeasy changed all of this with remarkable swiftness. Because the speakeasy was illegal, it existed outside the normal social taxonomy. The rules that applied to legal public spaces, the rules about which types of people could go where, did not apply to the illegal basement bar in the same way. Women went to speakeasies. They went on dates and with groups of girlfriends. They drank at the bar beside men they were not married to. They paid for their own drinks. This last point, seemingly small, was actually significant. A woman who paid for her own drink was not obligated to anyone for that drink. She was a customer, not a guest, not a charity case, not someone whose presence depended on the goodwill of a male companion. The economic independence that was making its way slowly into women's lives, through new employment, through the first generation of women earning their own wages in offices and shops, expressed itself in the speakeasy in a very simple, immediate way. She could buy her own glass of gin, and she did not owe anyone anything for it. What did a speakeasy actually look like? They varied enormously. At the top of the scale were places like the 21 Club in New York, which had hidden wine cellars with a system of pressurized pipes that could drain the bottles if the police showed up. A gleaming, sophisticated establishment that served excellent food and attracted politicians, business leaders, actors, and writers alongside their flappers and their hip flasks. These high end speakeasies were in many ways better and more glamorous than the legal establishments they had replaced. The illegality became part of the experience, part of what you were paying for. At the lower end of the scale were the rough basements and converted apartments where the liquor was poorly made and sometimes genuinely dangerous. Industrial alcohol redistilled in improvised stills, which could cause blindness or death if the process went wrong, and where the crowd was less picturesque and the danger more real. The flapper of popular imagination spent her time in the glamorous version, the working class girl who was also drinking her way through prohibition often had access only to the cheaper, rougher version. The drinks themselves were largely terrible. Prohibition had driven out the professional distillers and left the market to amateurs. Bathtub gin was not a metaphor. Some of it really was made in bathtubs, in apartments, from grain alcohol mixed with water and flavored with juniper oil and whatever else was available. The Prohibition era cocktail was partly a product of creativity and partly a product of necessity. Mixed drinks with strong flavors helped to disguise the unpleasant taste of badly made spirits. The gin Ricky, the bee's knees, the sidecar, the gin and tonic. The word cocktail itself was not new in the 1920s, but the culture of cocktail drinking as a sophisticated, slightly dangerous social ritual was very much a prohibition creation. Drinking itself, for the flapper, had a dual meaning. On one level, it was simple pleasure, social lubrication, the warmth and loosening that alcohol provides. But on another level, it was an act of claimed equality. Women had not, historically, been drinkers. Drinking was a male vice, or a disreputable female one. For the flapper to drink openly, to hold her glass and sip her cocktail with visible enjoyment, was to assert her right to the full range of human pleasures that had previously been distributed unequally by gender. The hip flask was the decade's signature accessory for the truly committed. Small enough to tuck into a garter or a handbag, the flask allowed the flapper to carry her own supply wherever she went. To a party where the host might not have managed to acquire liquor, to a sporting event, to a dance that had not yet attracted the attention of a bootlegger. The flask was independence made portable. It meant you did not have to depend on anyone else for your drink. Police enforcement of prohibition was, to put it charitably, inconsistent. Many police officers were bribed by the bootleggers whose operations they were supposed to shut down. Many simply looked the other way because everyone around them was doing the same thing. Some raids happened and could be genuinely frightening, particularly in lower class establishments where the clientele had less social protection. A wealthy socialite caught in a speakeasy raid might have her lawyer on the phone within the hour. A working class girl from the wrong neighborhood might spend the night in jail and lose her job. But the overall enforcement failure was so obvious, so widely understood, and so widely ridiculed that it colored the whole decade with a particular attitude toward law and authority. Laws, it turned out, could be flouted on an enormous scale with minimal consequences for most people. The government, it turned out, could be wrong. The old moral order, it turned out, was not backed by the practical force it had always claimed to have. This was a lesson that ran deeper than drinking. It was a lesson about the nature of authority itself. Perhaps no aspect of the flapper's life generated more alarm, more newspaper column inches, more pulpit thunder, more worried letters in advice columns than her apparent relationship with sexual morality. The flapper, as her critics characterized her, was sexually loose. She necked in parked cars. She petted at parties. She went on unchaperoned dates. She was, in the language of the time, fast. She was the harbinger of a moral apocalypse that was going to destroy the foundations of civilization. The reality, as usual, was considerably more complicated. To understand what was actually happening, you have to understand what had come before. In the Victorian era, and well into the early 20th century, the dominant middle class ideal of female sexuality was essentially one of absence. Respectable women were not supposed to have sexual desires. They submitted to their husband's needs as a marital duty, an act of wifely obligation rather than personal pleasure. Female sexual desire, to the extent it was acknowledged at all, was considered a symptom of moral weakness or mental disorder. The medical literature of the period is full of women being diagnosed with hysteria and treated with a baffling array of interventions for what we would now recognize as completely normal sexual frustration. Meanwhile, the double standard operated in its familiar and brutal way. Men were understood to have sexual needs that could not be denied. These needs were accommodated by a two-tier system in which good women were protected from male sexuality inside the institution of marriage, while another class of women, prostitutes, loose women, women of the lower classes, absorbed the sexual demands that good women were not supposed to satisfy. This system was vicious and unfair, and almost everyone who operated within it knew it on some level, but it had the advantage of clarity. You knew which kind of woman you were. The flapper smashed this taxonomy. She was not a prostitute. She was not a woman of the lower classes, necessarily. She was not a fallen woman in the traditional sense. But she was also not behaving according to the rules that were supposed to govern respectable women. She went out with men unchaperoned. She allowed physical contact outside of formal courtship. She talked about sex with her friends in ways that would have been inconceivable to her grandmother. She read books and magazines that discussed sexual topics openly. She had, in many cases, had what she and her friends called experience. Part of what made this possible was the automobile, the car, which became widely available to the middle class during the 1920s thanks to Ford's assembly line and the installment credit plan, was not just transportation. It was a private, mobile space. It could be driven away from the neighborhood, away from the neighbors who would notice and comment, away from the parents who would object. The parked car became the decade's signature private space for unchaperoned heterosexual contact. The joke was that the invention of the automobile had done more for premarital sexuality than any shift in moral values, and like most good jokes, it was more or less true. Sigmund Freud's ideas had been circulating in American intellectual life since the early 1910s, and by the 1920s had filtered into general cultural consciousness in a simplified, popularized form. The key takeaway, as the popular press conveyed it, was something like, repressing your natural impulses is bad for you. Victorian sexual repression had produced neurotic, unhappy people. Acknowledging and expressing your desires was healthy. This was not exactly what Freud had argued, but it was what people believed he had argued, and it gave a psychological vocabulary to what the younger generation was already inclined to do. The companionate marriage movement, which was gaining traction among progressive thinkers in the 1920s, proposed that marriage should be based on emotional and sexual compatibility rather than primarily on economic arrangement and social obligation. Books like Companionate Marriage by Judge Ben Lindsay, 1927, argued that young people should be allowed to enter into trial marriages with birth control freely available, and that marriage should be understood as a partnership of equals rather than a union of owner and property. These ideas were extremely controversial, but they were being discussed. They were in the cultural air. Young women were reading about them in magazines. Birth control was becoming somewhat more accessible, though it remained illegal to advertise contraceptives in most states and was still largely unavailable to poor women. Margaret Sanger had opened the first birth control clinic in America in 1916 and was engaged in a long, legal, and political fight for contraceptive rights throughout the 1920s. Condoms could be purchased at barber shops and certain drugstores. Diaphragms could be obtained from sympathetic doctors. The availability was inconsistent and class stratified. Wealthy women had far better access than poor ones. But the shift was real. For the first time in American history, there was at least the possibility, for some women, of sexual activity that did not carry the near certain consequence of pregnancy. What did all of this actually mean for the flapper in practice? Historians have done their best to piece together the reality from the survey data, the diaries, the court records, and the sociological studies of the period. Premarital sex appears to have been more common in the 1920s than in previous generations, but the increase was less dramatic than the moral panic suggested. What increased much more significantly was premarital petting, physical intimacy that stopped short of intercourse. The phenomenon of necking and petting became for the first time a recognized and widely discussed social behavior rather than something that happened in secret and was not spoken of. Young people were doing it openly enough that their parents knew they were doing it. The doing had not, perhaps, increased as dramatically as the knowing. What had changed most profoundly was the cultural meaning attached to female sexuality. A woman who had some experience of physical intimacy before marriage was no longer automatically ruined, at least not in the urban, educated, relatively progressive milieus where the flapper was at home. She might still keep her history private. She might still be careful about her reputation. But there was an emerging understanding that a woman was a person with desires, that those desires were not shameful, and that a marriage without sexual compatibility was a recipe for misery. This reframing, this fundamental shift in what female sexuality meant, was perhaps the most lasting change the flapper generation made. It is also worth noting what the flapper was not. She was not, in most cases, interested in dispensing with marriage entirely. The goal was not to overthrow the institution, it was to enter it on better terms. The flapper wanted a husband she chose freely, based on attraction and compatibility, rather than one chosen for her based on economic calculation. She wanted a marriage in which she retained some of her own identity and autonomy. She wanted, in short, to be a partner rather than a possession. These were not radical demands by modern standards, but in 1922 they were. The image of the flapper is so thoroughly associated with leisure, with dancing and drinking and lounging in automobiles, that it is easy to forget that many, perhaps most, flappers had jobs. The 1920s saw an extraordinary expansion of female employment in the United States, particularly in the white collar sector. The growth of large corporations, department stores, banks, insurance companies, and government agencies in the early 20th century had created an enormous demand for clerical workers, typists, stenographers, telephone operators, filing clerks, bookkeepers, and the gender of these workers had, fairly rapidly, become predominantly female. Why? Partly because women could be paid less, partly because the work was considered light and therefore suitable for women, partly because the old male professions, law, medicine, business, engineering, still maintained their barriers effectively enough that educated women who wanted to work had limited options. The office became a female space in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the previous generation, and a middle class girl of the 1920s who went to work as a secretary or a telephone operator was doing something entirely normal. The telephone operator deserves particular mention. The telephone switchboard was almost entirely staffed by women from the 1880s onward. The job had been tried with male operators first and abandoned. Women, it was decided, had the right voice, the right temperament, the right patience for the work. By the 1920s, hundreds of thousands of women across America were working in telephone exchanges, sitting at long switchboards, plugging and unplugging connections, handling the constant flow of calls from businesses and homes. It was repetitive work and physically constraining. You sat in one place for hours, but it provided steady wages and it was respectable. And the telephone operator was, in her way, a participant in the communication revolution that was transforming the decade. Department stores employed thousands of women as salesgirls. The new world of consumer culture required people to sell it, to stand behind counters and demonstrate products and help customers make choices. Salesgirls were expected to look presentable, to embody in their appearance the appeal of the products they were selling. A cosmetics counter salesgirl who did not wear makeup was no cosmetics counter salesgirl at all. The department store was, in a strange way, one of the first professional spaces where a woman's stylish appearance was not a distraction from her job, but actually part of it. Nursing was expanding rapidly. Social work was becoming a recognized profession, staffed almost entirely by women. Teaching, always a female dominated profession at the elementary level, continued to employ large numbers of young women, though many school systems required female teachers to resign upon marriage. The marriage bar, as it was called, was widespread and deeply resented. It was one of the mechanisms by which the culture continued to insist that women's proper destination was the home, regardless of their own inclinations or abilities. The wages these working women earned were not large by male standards, and were not intended to be. The prevailing assumption was that a woman who worked was either a young woman waiting to marry or a woman who had somehow failed to find a husband. Her wages were understood as supplementary, as pin money if she was young and living at home, or as a temporary necessity if she was unfortunate enough to have to support herself. The idea of a woman as a primary breadwinner who expected to support herself through her own labor for her entire life was still largely unthinkable in the mainstream culture. But the money, however modest, was transformative. A working woman in the 1920s who was living at home and contributing some portion of her wages to the household while keeping the rest had discretionary income in a way that previous generations of unmarried women simply had not. She could buy her own clothes. She could pay for her own movie ticket and her own lunch and her own hat from the millinery counter. She could save up for a pair of those T-strap dancing shoes. She was economically somewhat more autonomous than any generation of ordinary women before her. And this economic autonomy, however partial, changed the terms of the courtship market. A woman who could in principle support herself, even modestly, even imperfectly, was a woman who did not have to accept the first marriage proposal she received. She could wait for someone she actually wanted. She had, within limits, choices. The terror of spinsterhood that had governed the calculations of previous generations of women, the understanding that an unmarried woman was both economically and socially precarious, had not disappeared, but its edge had dulled somewhat. A smaller but significant number of women in the 1920s were pursuing professional careers. Law and medicine remained difficult, the barriers were high, and the hostility was real, but women were entering both fields in small numbers. Journalism was opening up. Advertising, which was expanding rapidly into a major industry, employed women in copywriting and design. The fashion industry, obviously, had female designers and executives. Edna St. Vincent Millay was writing poetry that was selling enormously and making her one of the decade's celebrities. Zelda Fitzgerald was writing, though her work would be overshadowed for decades by her husband's. Dorothy Parker was at the Algonquin Round Table, holding her own with the wittiest minds in New York. These professional women, creative women, were part of the flappers' world. They were not all flappers in the strict sense. Some of them were older than the typical flapper. Some of them were more earnestly feminist than the flapper's style generally allowed for. But they were part of the same cultural moment. They were proof that the old confinements were loosening. They were evidence, visible, in magazines and newspapers and on the theater marquees, that a woman's life could be built around something other than a husband. There was also the small but growing number of women entering business for themselves, female entrepreneurs in the beauty industry, particularly. The 1920s saw the explosive growth of beauty parlors, salons where women got their hair bobbed and waved and their nails done. Many of these were owned and operated by women. The beauty industry, which catered almost entirely to women, was increasingly run by women. Madam C. J. Walker, who had died in 1919, had demonstrated in the previous decade that an African American woman entrepreneur could build a massive business in hair care products. Her success was a template that others were following. The flapper was not just a social phenomenon. She was also an enormous cultural one. She was written about, filmed, painted, satirized, celebrated, and condemned with an intensity that reflected just how much cultural anxiety and excitement she was generating. F. Scott Fitzgerald, who named the entire decade, who gave it its most indelible images, who chronicled the Jazz Age with a precision and a glamour that made him its unofficial poet laureate, was also, more than any other single writer, the creator of the literary flapper. His first novel, This Side of Paradise, published in 1920, made him famous overnight and introduced to a mass audience a new kind of young woman, reckless, beautiful, self possessed, and somewhat terrifying. His early short stories in the Saturday Evening Post featured flappers by the dozen. The Beautiful and Damned, published in 1922, gave the world Gloria Patch, a woman of breathtaking selfishness and charm, whose story does not end happily because Fitzgerald always understood that the party had a cost. And then there was Daisy Buchanan, the most famous literary creation of the decade, perhaps the most analyzed female character in American literature. Daisy, in The Great Gatsby, 1925, is not quite a flapper in the strict sense. She is too old, too married, too settled in her carelessness. But she is a product of the same world, and the novel's real flapper might be Jordan Baker, cool, athletic, androgynous in her manner, professionally accomplished. She is a golfer and entirely comfortable with deception. Fitzgerald was not, in the end, a straightforward celebrant of the new woman. His flappers are dazzling and destructive in roughly equal measure, but his ambivalence was itself culturally honest. The 1920s were not a simple story. Edna Ferber was writing about working women. Anita Luce published Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1925, a wickedly funny first person novel about a gold digging flapper named Lorelei Lee who is simultaneously more intelligent and more ruthless than anyone around her realizes. The novel sold 300,000 copies in its first year. It was translated into 14 languages. It was, among other things, a joke the flapper was making at the expense of all the men who had underestimated her. The movies were equally in love with the flapper. Silent film in the early and mid 1920s gave audiences a parade of flapper heroines, bright, fast moving, frequently in trouble, and frequently getting out of it. Clara Bow was the flapper's face on screen. A working class girl from Brooklyn who had gotten to Hollywood on her looks and her energy, Bow had enormous dark eyes and a quality of absolute presence on screen that made audiences fall in love with her. Her 1927 film, It, based on a story by Eleanor Glynn, popularized the phrase "it girl" as a term for a woman of irresistible personal magnetism. Bow's "it" was explicitly sexual, a kind of animal appeal that went beyond beauty into something more fundamental. The film made her the biggest box office star in America for several years. Louise Brooks was another. Where Bow was warm and accessible, Brooks was cool, sharp, cutting. Her bob was the most perfect bob anyone had ever had. Lacquered and geometric, it became an icon of the era. She went to Germany to make films with director G. W. Pabst. Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl, both released in 1929, that portrayed female sexuality with a frankness that American studios would not allow, and that still feels startling. Brooks was not interested in being likable. Her heroines were autonomous, complicated, and ultimately tragic in ways that said uncomfortable things about what happens to women who refuse to play by the rules. Joan Crawford, before she became the grande dame of Hollywood melodrama, was in her early career a very convincing flapper. Her 1928 film, Our Dancing Daughters featured her as a wild dancing girl who is ultimately vindicated while her more conventional rival is destroyed, a moral resolution that must have been deeply satisfying to the flapper in the audience. These films reached millions of people who had never been to New York or Chicago, who had never heard jazz live, who would never set foot in a speakeasy. The movies brought the flapper to the small town and the farm. They showed girls who had grown up in conservative, restricted environments what a different kind of life looked like. The effect was profound and difficult to measure, but undeniable. Young women in small town Kansas or rural Georgia were watching Clara on the movie screen and thinking things they might not have thought before. Magazines were equally important as a vector for flapper culture. The 1920s were a golden age of American magazine publishing. The Saturday Evening Post had a circulation of nearly 3 million. Cosmopolitan, Vanity Fair, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, The New Yorker, founded in 1925. These publications reached an enormous audience. Their advertising was saturated with flapper imagery, young, stylish, independent seeming women who wore the right clothes and the right cosmetics and seemed to live lives of enviable glamour. The New Yorker, in particular, from its earliest issues, took the cultural world of the 1920s seriously and covered it with a sophistication and wit that made it essential reading for anyone who wanted to understand the decade. John Held Jr. was the decade's defining illustrator. His images of flappers, all angles and energy, girls with bobbed hair and rolled stockings, and impossibly long legs doing improbably athletic dances, appeared everywhere. His flappers were satirical in a gentle way, exaggerated, cartoonishly lively, but they captured something true about the spirit of the figure. They made the flapper look fun. They made her look like she was having the best time anyone had ever had. And this, perhaps more than any other single thing, was what made her so culturally powerful. Not the scandal, not the transgression, the sheer, visible, infectious fun of her. The advertising industry discovered the flapper and did not let her go. Cigarette companies, in particular, were eager to expand their market to include women and used flapper imagery aggressively to make smoking seem glamorous and modern and a mark of the liberated woman. Reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet, Lucky Strike advertised, simultaneously marketing cigarettes as weight loss aids and liberation symbols. The flapper with her cigarette became one of the decade's most reproduced images. What had been considered a mark of low character in a woman became, through the alchemy of advertising, a mark of sophistication. The flapper did not arrive in the world without resistance. She was met with enormous, sometimes furious, sometimes genuinely frightened opposition from a wide variety of corners. An understanding that opposition tells us as much about the decade as understanding the flapper herself. The most visible opposition came from religious institutions. Protestant ministers across America preached against the flapper throughout the decade. Billy Sunday, the era's most famous evangelist, was thunderous on the subject. The bobbed hair, the short skirts, the dancing, the drinking, all were symptoms of the same spiritual disease. The country, in the view of these critics, was abandoning God in pursuit of pleasure. The young woman who bobbed her hair and went to the dance hall was not merely making a fashion choice. She was turning away from everything that had made America Christian and good These sermons reached enormous audiences. Sunday could fill a stadium, and they gave theological language to an anxiety that was much more broadly felt. Catholic voices joined the chorus. Cardinal O'Connell of Boston was particularly eloquent on the subject of immodest dress. Many parochial schools had regulations about hem lengths and hairstyles. The women's auxiliaries of Catholic organizations passed resolutions condemning flapper fashions. The papal encyclicals of the period addressed questions of female modesty with an urgency that reflected how seriously the Church viewed the cultural moment. The moral panic had explicitly political dimensions as well. The 1920s were, in many respects, a decade of conservative cultural retrenchment. The Ku Klux Klan, revived in 1915 and transformed into a mass movement by the early 1920s, included in its list of concerns not only its traditional targets of racial and ethnic minorities, but also sexual immorality, changing gender roles, and the decline of Protestant Christian values. At its peak in 1924, the Klan had somewhere between 3 and 6 million members, not just in the South, but throughout the Midwest and even in some northern cities. Its vision of America, white, Protestant, morally pure, organized around traditional family structures, was directly opposed to everything the flapper represented. The medical profession weighed in. Throughout the 1920s, doctors wrote articles in medical journals and popular magazines warning about the health risks of flapper behavior. The dancing was too strenuous. The thin clothing exposed women to cold. The cosmetics contained dangerous chemicals. The drinking was ruining women's health. The late nights were destroying constitutions that were naturally more fragile than men's. Much of this medical concern was transparently political, a way of dressing up traditional social control in the language of science and health. But it carried the authority of professional expertise and was taken seriously by many people. Women themselves were not uniformly on the flapper's side. Many of the most vociferous critics of the flapper were women of the generation immediately preceding hers. Women who had fought for suffrage, who had spent decades in disciplined, serious, morally earnest political organizing, sometimes found the flapper's apparent frivolity infuriating. They had not marched and been imprisoned and force-fed in jail so that young women could bob their hair and drink gin. The suffrage movement had argued in large part that women should have the vote because they were morally superior to men, more responsible, more serious, more concerned with the common good. The flapper seemed designed to undermine this argument entirely. There were also women who opposed the flapper from a more conservative position, women who genuinely believed in the traditional values the flapper was abandoning. Mothers who wept over their daughters' bobbed hair were not all hypocrites or tyrants. Many of them had built meaningful lives within the old structures. Many of them genuinely feared for their daughters in a world where the old protections were being discarded before new ones were in place. Their fear was not irrational. A woman who claimed sexual freedom in a world that still had no reliable birth control, no legal abortion, no economic safety net for single mothers, and a labor market that would fire her for getting pregnant, was taking real risks. The old rules had been terrible, but they had also, in their terrible way, provided a kind of structure. The debate about the flapper was also more subtly a debate about class and aspiration. The upper class had always had access to private vice. Wealthy women and men had always been able to drink and carry on in ways that the middle class could not afford to do in public without consequences. What was new in the 1920s was that these formerly private vices were becoming public and democratized. The middle class girl was not supposed to behave like this, and there was a whole vocabulary of class anxiety around the flapper, the suggestion that she was cheapening herself, lowering herself to the level of the disreputable, that could be read as either genuine morality or simple snobbery, depending on your perspective. Employers participated in the pushback in more concrete ways. As I mentioned earlier, some employers fired women for bobbing their hair. Others had explicit policies about the length of skirts. Department stores, acutely aware of their respectable reputation, sometimes required salesgirls to maintain conservative appearances that contradicted the fashions they were selling. Banks and insurance companies were particularly conservative. The working flapper had to navigate the contradiction between her off hours identity and the face she presented to the professional world. And then there were the simply baffled, the people who were not angry exactly, but genuinely could not understand. Parents who had given their daughters everything they had, who had worked hard, lived carefully, tried to do right, and who now found themselves sitting across the breakfast table from a strange creature with a bob and rolled stockings who used slang they did not understand and came home at 3 in the morning smelling of cigarette smoke. The generational bewilderment of the 1920s was real and it ran deep. The decade had moved so fast. The cultural landscape had shifted so dramatically in such a short time that parents and children of even a decade's age difference sometimes inhabited what felt like entirely different worlds. Every subculture develops its own language. The flapper was no exception. The slang of the 1920s was extraordinarily rich and inventive, a linguistic world unto itself that served the double function of communicating efficiently within the group and creating a barrier against the uninitiated. Much of this slang was originally African American in origin, filtered into mainstream white usage through jazz culture, through the speakeasies, through the cultural exchange that happened when white audiences went to black neighborhoods to hear jazz. The word jazz itself is one example. Cool in its sense of stylish and admirable. Cat for a hip, with it person. Jam for improvised music. Chick for a girl. This borrowing was, of course, an aspect of the cultural appropriation that ran throughout the flapper era, the way white youth culture consumed and repackaged black cultural production without always acknowledging or compensating its origins. The flapper's specific vocabulary had its own flavor. Something wonderful was the bee's knees, or the cat's pajamas, or the cat's meow, or the elephant's eyebrows, or the eel's ankle. There was an entire category of absurdist zoological idioms for expressing superlative approval. Something bad or boring was the berries used negatively, or a pill, or a flat tire, specifically a boring companion. An attractive man was a chic, after the enormously popular Rudolph Valentino film of 1921. An attractive woman was a Sheba. A person who was behaving foolishly was a goof, or a sap, or a Mrs. Grundy, this last being a reference to a character from an old play who had become a byword for priggish conventionality. To spill meant to tell, as in to spill the story. To neck and to pet had their already noted meanings. To park was to sit in a parked car with one's companion, the car being understood as the primary venue for physical intimacy. To be pickled or ossified or spifflicated was to be drunk. The drunk person might be pie-eyed or blotto. A party, specifically a good one, was a brawl or a wingding. A dull one was a flat. Money was called kale or lettuce or bread. A dollar was a buck. An attractive person had it, the famous it that Clara possessed. A person who lacked style or attraction was a wet blanket, or a wet smack, or, in its most brutal formulation, a bank. Police were blue bottles, or the fuzz, or the heat. To be arrested was to be pinched. To escape trouble was to give someone the air, or to take a powder, to disappear quickly. An illegal drinking establishment was a blind pig, or a juice joint, or a speakeasy itself, the etymology of which is simply the instruction to speak quietly about such a place, to not advertise it. The slang functioned, as slang always does, as a kind of social membership card. If you knew the words, if you could use them correctly, fluently, without sounding like you had learned them from a newspaper article, you belonged. You were in. You were one of the people who understood the current of the decade. If you didn't know them, if you used them wrong or looked blank when someone else used them, you were outside. You were Mrs. Grundy. You were a blue nose, a term for a priggish moralist, or a killjoy, or a wet blanket. There were also the codes that were more behavioral than verbal. The way you wore your stockings, rolled down as mentioned, rather than held up with garters. The way you handled a cigarette, women of the previous generation who smoked, and some did secretly, held the cigarette close to the body, directed the smoke away. The flapper held it openly, at shoulder height, in an attitude of obvious enjoyment. The way you dealt with an unwanted male companion, the brush off, was an art form, practiced and refined. To be brushed off was to be dismissed with a casual competence that left no room for argument. Magazines and newspapers contributed to the linguistic proliferation. The flapper's lexicon was written up in columns and glossaries with a mixture of amusement and alarm. Readers who were not flappers could keep up with the argot of the young, could know, theoretically, what their daughters were saying. This translation, the mainstream culture's attempt to decode the subculture's language, was itself part of the phenomenon. The flapper's slang became, through the magazines and movies, common cultural property. Words that had originated in specific urban, African American, or jazz culture contexts became national. This was, in miniature, exactly how the 1920s worked. The mass media, print, film, radio, took local cultural innovations and broadcast them everywhere. What had been regional and specific became national and general. The flapper of New York and the flapper of Kansas City and the flapper of San Francisco all spoke, with local variations, the same basic argot because they had all read the same magazines and seen the same movies. The decade's genuine cultural diversity was in some ways flattened by the very media that spread its innovations. The letters that flappers wrote to each other, the ones that have survived in archives and private collections, are sometimes startlingly contemporary in their voice. A letter from a 19-year-old girl in Chicago in 1924 to her friend in New York reads in places as if it might have been written last week. The self awareness, the irony, the mixture of genuine emotional intensity with performed casualness, the capacity to be both very young and very sophisticated at the same time. These were not simple people. They were people in the process of inventing a new way of being young, a way that, in its essential outlines, we are still living with. The flapper was not just stylishly thin, she was athletic in a way that was genuinely new for mainstream femininity. The same liberation of the body that allowed her to dance the Charleston allowed her to play tennis, swim, ride bicycles, and participate in sports that had previously been considered incompatible with feminine decorum. Physical exercise for women had not been entirely absent before the 1920s. The bicycle craze of the 1890s had briefly liberated an earlier generation of women, and the sight of a woman on a bicycle in the rational dress reform clothes that made bicycling possible had generated its own round of moral panic. College women in the late 19th century had played basketball and tennis in their gymnasium classes. Some women had been swimming, but in each case, the sport was hedged about with restrictions designed to protect feminine respectability. Exercise was acceptable if it was gentle enough not to cause visible physical effort. Sweating was not ladylike. Vigorous exertion was not ladylike. Visible physical strength, muscles specifically, was certainly not ladylike. The ideal female body was not strong. It was slender and soft and arranged for decorative purposes. The flapper changed this. The ideal flapper body was thin, yes, but it was thin in a way that suggested activity rather than delicacy. The dropped waist of the flapper dress revealed the hips and the legs in motion. The short skirt showed the leg working. The ideal was boyish and angular, a body that suggested it might actually do something other than sit beautifully in a drawing room. Tennis was the flapper's sport par excellence. By the mid 1920s, women's tennis was a major spectator sport, and its stars were celebrities. Helen Wills, who won the U.S. national championships 8 times between 1923 and 1931, was one of the decade's great female icons. She played with an aggressive, powerful baseline game that was completely unlike the soft, passive style considered appropriate for female players in previous generations. She competed in a short skirt that showed her knees, which was itself news. She was athletic and strong and made no apology for it. She was, in her way, a flapper of the tennis court. Swimming was another. The 1920 Olympics in Antwerp had featured women's swimming events for the first time, and American women had done extremely well. Gertrude Ederlo, who in 1926 became the first woman to swim the English Channel, and who did it faster than any man had done it before her, was a national heroine. Her feat was celebrated not just as athletic achievement, but as evidence that the new woman was more capable than anyone had previously imagined. Golf, previously a very conservative sport associated with upper class respectability, was being played by women in increasing numbers. The golf course was one of the few outdoor spaces where a woman could spend several hours in vigorous physical activity without significant social commentary, because the sport itself had such an air of gentility that no one quite knew how to object to it. The outdoor movement of the 1920s brought camping, hiking, and what was called motoring, driving for pleasure, into women's lives. The automobile made all of these accessible. A woman with access to a car could drive herself to the countryside, could explore, could be physically active in ways that had previously required male accompaniment or complex social arrangements. The touring vacation, the road trip in its earliest form, became a leisure option for middle class families in the 1920s, and women participated fully. Physical culture, what we would now call fitness culture, was gaining mainstream acceptance. Health and beauty magazines proliferated. Exercise advice columns appeared. The idea that a woman should actively manage her physical condition through diet, through exercise, through regular activity became more mainstream. This was partly vanity. The flapper ideal required a slim body, and the magazines were happy to sell products and advice that promised one. But it was also, in a more genuine sense, a new understanding of the female body as something capable and active rather than passive and decorative. The diet culture of the 1920s was its own complicated phenomenon. The thin flapper ideal created enormous pressure on women to control their weight, pressure that was, in retrospect, the beginning of a long and often damaging relationship between women and their bodies. The corset had reshaped women's bodies from the outside. The thin ideal of the 1920s began the project of reshaping them from the inside through what you ate, what you did, how you managed yourself. Cigarettes were marketed as appetite suppressants. Laxatives were marketed as weight loss aids. Crash diets were discussed in magazines. The flapper's freedom from the corset was real, but it came with a new set of bodily demands that were in some ways equally constraining. Still, the net effect on women's relationship with physical activity and the physical world was genuinely liberating. A generation of women who played tennis and swam and danced and hiked and drove had a different experience of their own bodies, a different sense of what those bodies could do than the generation that had grown up laced into corsets and warned off exertion. The physical confidence of the flapper, her ease in her own skin, her comfort with movement and space, was one of her most lasting contributions to the idea of what a woman could be. The flapper was not exclusively an American phenomenon. She was, in her essential character, an international one, appearing in various forms wherever urban, modern, post war culture was reshaping the lives of young women. In Britain, the flapper had deep roots. The word itself was British in origin. The post war years in Britain were marked by the same combination of grief and release that characterized the American 1920s. The war had killed an entire generation of young British men. The scale of loss in Britain was, if anything, even more devastating than in America, because Britain had been in the war from 1914, while America did not enter until 1917. The women left behind lived in a world with a significant shortage of men, a demographic fact that had real consequences for the marriage market and for the choices available to women. The British flapper, sometimes called the bright young thing, inhabited the same cultural spaces as her American counterpart: jazz clubs, cocktail bars, the theater, the countryside house party, which remained a distinctly British institution. She read the same books. Aldous Huxley's Chrome Yellow and Antic Hay were the British literary counterparts to Fitzgerald's novels, and she wore the same fashions because Parisian fashion set the terms for both American and British style. Paris was, in many ways, the flapper's spiritual capital. Coco Chanel, who was transforming fashion in exactly the ways that flappers needed, was Parisian. Her aesthetic of comfortable, functional, elegant simplicity, the cardigan suit, the little black dress, jersey fabrics that moved with the body rather than against it, was the mature, sophisticated version of everything the flapper was reaching toward. Chanel herself had a biography that was, in some respects, a flapper story in excelsis: poor origins, self invention, independence from male patronage, professional achievement on her own terms. She had had lovers, she had smoked, she had cut her own hair short and worn her own practical clothes. She had been scandalous and become respectable and made the transition so thoroughly that she invented what respectable now looked like. The garçon look from the scandalous French novel La Garçonne, 1922, was the French version of the flapper. The garçon, literally boyish girl, wore her hair short, smoked, drank, had sexual relationships outside of marriage, and refused the traditional feminine roles. The novel was a sensation across Europe and beyond. It was banned in some countries and wildly discussed in others. Its title became a shorthand for the new woman across the Francophone world and beyond. In Germany, particularly in Weimar era Berlin, the equivalent figure was even more radical. The Neue Frau, the new woman, was a subject of intense cultural discussion throughout the 1920s. Berlin in the Weimar Republic was briefly one of the most culturally experimental cities in the world. The cabaret culture that would later be immortalized in the musical Cabaret was then a real living thing, transgressive, political, sexually experimental, in ways that went well beyond anything available in New York. Women in Weimar Germany had received voting rights in 1918 and were entering public life in large numbers. The new cinema, German Expressionism, was producing female characters of enormous complexity and darkness. Marlene Dietrich, who would become an international star by the end of the decade, was in her early career a Neue Frau figure, androgynous, sophisticated, thoroughly modern. In Japan, the moga, a shortening of moden gaaru, or modern girl, was the Japanese equivalent of the flapper. She appeared in the cities, Tokyo and Osaka primarily, in the mid 1920s. She wore Western clothes. She cut her hair in a Western style. She went to Western style cafes and dance halls. She was a product of Japan's rapid westernization and the growing consumer culture of the cities, and she was viewed by traditionalists with the same combination of fascination and horror that the American flapper provoked at home. In China, the modern xiaojie, modern miss, was navigating the tensions between traditional Chinese culture, the upheavals of the Republican era, and the flood of Western cultural influences that were reshaping urban life. In cities like Shanghai, which was in the 1920s one of the most cosmopolitan and culturally complex cities on earth, a version of the flapper appeared that was neither fully Western nor fully traditional. She wore the qipaos, the fitted Chinese dress, but in the new shorter, more body-conscious style that was influenced by both Chinese fashion tradition and Western modernity. She went to dance halls. She went to movies. She was, in her way, a Chinese flapper. The global reach of the flapper phenomenon tells us something important. She was not simply an American invention that spread outward. She was a convergent development. Similar forces of urbanization, post war disruption, rising consumer culture, expanding female education and employment, and mass media producing similar figures in many different cultural contexts simultaneously. The American version was the one most widely exported because American movies and music dominated the global cultural market. But she was everywhere, and everywhere she appeared, she generated the same mixture of fascination and alarm. The global flapper panic of the 1920s was, at its deepest level, a panic about modernity itself, about the speed of change, about the loosening of traditional structures, about what would happen to the world if the old certainties could not be maintained. The flapper was modernity's most visible and most intimate representative. She was living in people's homes, at their breakfast tables, in their churches. The conflict with her was, in some sense, the conflict with everything that was happening. The 1920s ended, as everyone knows, with a crash. The stock market collapse of October 1929. Black Thursday, Black Monday, Black Tuesday, the names accumulating in quick succession, wiped out fortunes overnight, sent the financial system into free fall, and began the Great Depression that would reshape American life for a decade. The flapper did not survive the Depression, not as a cultural type anyway. The particular conditions that had made her possible, the prosperity, the disposable income, the optimism, the sense that history was on an upswing and the old rules were optional. All of those conditions were swept away in the catastrophe. By the early 1930s, the flapper seemed not just dated, but obscenely so. The image of a girl dancing in a speakeasy, spending money on gin and cigarettes and silk stockings in a world where millions of people were standing in bread lines was deeply uncomfortable. The Jazz Age's famous carelessness looked in retrospect like exactly that, carelessness. The party had ended and the cleanup was grim. The cultural shift was rapid and dramatic. The fashions of the early 1930s reversed nearly everything the flapper had established. Skirts went back down, the waist returned, hair grew out. The silhouette became softer, more curved, more traditionally feminine. The Depression brought a cultural turn toward earnestness, toward collective struggle, toward a serious documentary-style realism that had no patience for the flapper's sparkle. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 closed another chapter. Legal drinking returned, but the speakeasy as a social institution was gone. The illegal, egalitarian, rule-breaking social space where men and women had drunk together on more or less equal terms gave way to legal bars that promptly reimposed many of the old gender norms. Women could now legally buy drinks in many establishments, but the spirit of transgression that had made the speakeasy meaningful was no longer available to them. What did the women who had been flappers do next? Most of them, eventually, did what their grandmothers had done. They married, they had children. Many of them settled into lives that were, on the surface, not dramatically different from the domestic lives their mothers had lived. The Depression removed many of the economic options that had given young women independence in the 1920s. The marriage bar tightened in many industries, as men competed desperately for every available job and women were pushed out of the workforce. The working woman was reframed in the culture of the 1930s as someone who was taking a job away from a man who needed it to support his family. But the women who had been flappers were not the same as the women who had come before them. They had lived differently, even if briefly. They had had a different relationship with their bodies, with their desires, with their own authority over their lives. And when they raised their daughters, the generation that would come of age in the 1940s and 1950s, they passed on something, even if they could not always name exactly what it was. The 1950s housewife existed in a direct dialectical relationship with the flapper. The feminine mystique that Betty Friedan would dissect in 1963 was in part a cultural overcorrection to the flapper's freedom. The ideal of the perfect suburban housewife, entirely devoted to home and family, making no demands on the public world. This ideal was partly a response to the alarm the flapper had generated. See, the culture seemed to be saying, this is where female freedom leads. Better to go back. Better to stay home. Better to be good. But something of the flapper remained. The right to wear what you wanted. The right to be seen in public without male accompaniment. The right to work if you needed to or wanted to. The right to smoke and drink if you chose to. These rights, once claimed, proved difficult to entirely revoke. The cultural memory of the flapper, the speakeasy, the bob, the Charleston, became one of the anchors of nostalgia for a vanished freedom. And the young women of the 1960s, when they began the second wave of feminism, were in some sense picking up the thread the flapper had dropped 30 years before. The great historian Paula Fass, writing about flappers in the 1970s, argued that the flapper's most lasting achievement was not the liberation of female sexuality or the overthrow of Victorian morality. It was something more subtle and more durable, the establishment of peer culture as a primary social force in young women's lives. Before the flapper era, young women's choices and behaviors were primarily governed by family and church, by older authorities who set the standards and enforced them. The flapper generation was the first for whom the opinions and behaviors of their peers, other young women, roughly their own age, were more important than the authority of their elders. This is the world we now live in. The peer group as the primary socializing force for adolescents and young adults. This is a 1920s invention. The flapper made it. History is, finally, not about types or trends or decades. It is about people, and the flapper, who risks being lost in the glittering generalization of her image, was a collection of individual women, each with her own particular story. Zelda Sayer, who would become Zelda Fitzgerald upon her marriage to F. Scott in 1920, was perhaps the most famous flapper in America during the decade, though the label sat uncomfortably on her. She was from Montgomery, Alabama, the daughter of a judge. She was beautiful and wild and brilliant in ways that the South of the 1910s had no framework for. She danced. She drank. She said outrageous things. She married Scott when she was 19, and they became, together, the glamorous embodiment of the Jazz Age. But Zelda's story is also one of the hardest cautionary tales the era has to offer. The freedom she claimed in her youth collided, in her marriage, with a husband who simultaneously celebrated her wildness and resented her independence. She wrote, and Scott used her letters, her diaries, her ideas in his own fiction without credit. She tried to become a professional dancer in her late 20s and was told she had started too late. She tried to publish her own novel, and Scott objected to passages that he felt overlapped with his own work in progress. In 1930, she had a breakdown, then another. She spent much of the remaining decades of her life in and out of sanatoriums. She died in a fire at a mental hospital in 1948. Zelda's story is extreme, but it is not entirely exceptional. The freedom the flapper claimed was real, but it was also provisional and contingent in ways that not every young woman fully understood. The culture that had allowed her some liberty during a brief window of youth was perfectly capable of withdrawing that liberty. The brilliant, unconventional girl who became a brilliant, unconventional woman often found that the world she lived in had prepared no place for her. Dorothy Parker is a more successful story, in professional terms at least. Born in 1893, she was somewhat older than the typical flapper, but she inhabited the same cultural world. She became the most celebrated wit of the decade through her work at Vanity Fair and The New Yorker, and her participation in the Algonquin Round Table lunches, where New York's literary intelligentsia gathered to make each other laugh. Her poetry was brilliant and heartbreaking in equal measure. Her short stories were devastating. She drank too much. She had complicated love affairs. She attempted suicide more than once, but she worked. She was taken seriously as a writer and as a voice. Her famous lines: "Men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses. I require three things in a man. He must be handsome, ruthless, and stupid. These have a flapper's wit applied to a flapper's themes. The sophisticated, ironic relationship with male attention, the self deprecating intelligence, the ability to make a devastating joke about the very constraints that were crushing you." Clara Bow's story is another. Born into desperate poverty in Brooklyn in 1905, she got to Hollywood through sheer force of talent and charisma. She became the biggest movie star in America. She was paid well. She was famous. She was to millions of young women the face of the decade. She was also exhausted, exploited, subjected to constant tabloid scrutiny of her private life, and eventually destroyed by the combination of personal troubles and the industry's transition to sound films, which she found technically challenging. She retired in her late 20s and spent much of the rest of her life in near seclusion. "I never enjoyed being famous," she said later. "It just meant more people were watching you be unhappy." Josephine Baker is the great story of the era that the mainstream flapper narrative too often omits. Born in St. Louis in 1906, she came to New York in the early 1920s as a teenager and worked her way into the chorus of Black Broadway. She was funny, athletic, and extraordinary, and she could not get work in white Broadway, which had no interest in black talent. She went to Paris in 1925 and became an overnight sensation, performing at the Folies Bergère in increasingly legendary shows that made her the most famous entertainer in Europe. She was everything the flapper was: liberated, modern, daring, physical, musical, and she was all of these things at a time when the American culture that celebrated the white flapper was actively working to exclude her from its freedoms. In Paris, she found the freedom that America withheld. She became a French citizen, performed extraordinary acts of resistance during the Second World War, and spent much of her later life working for civil rights. Her story is a flapper story and a great deal more besides. These individual stories, and the thousands of less famous ones that can be read in diaries and letters and oral histories, resist the simplification that the image of the flapper invites. The decade was not a liberation. It was not a catastrophe. It was a genuine, complicated world historical moment of change, and the women who lived through it experienced it in all its complications. Some of them flourished, some of them were broken, most of them fell somewhere between those poles, living lives that were larger and more self determined than their mothers' lives had been, and smaller and more constrained than they might have hoped. They danced, they drank, they bobbed their hair and rolled their stockings and put on their lipstick in public. They earned their own money and spent it on themselves. They drove cars and played tennis and went to the movies and made their own jokes. They married, most of them, and had children, most of them, and lived the rest of their lives in a world that never quite gave them all they had been briefly promised. But the briefly promised thing was real, and it mattered, and we are still, in so many ways, living in the world it opened. And so, as the music in the last speakeasy grows softer, as the last Charleston dancer sits down and catches her breath, as the phonograph needle reaches the end of the record and the room grows quiet, we come to the end of this long, slow journey through one of the most electric decades in modern history. The flapper was not a saint. She was not a heroine in the simple sense. She was a human being living in a moment of extraordinary change, sometimes reckless, sometimes brilliant, sometimes careless, sometimes brave. She made choices that were not always wise and took freedoms that were not always safe. She lived at a speed that the decade demanded and that the Depression would eventually exhaust. But she was also something genuinely new in the world, a woman who insisted, for perhaps the first time in the history of mainstream Western culture, on being both respectable and free, on keeping her hair short and her opinions loud, on dancing until her feet hurt and then dancing some more, on being fully and without apology herself. She is worth remembering, she is worth understanding, and she is, in all her complexity and contradiction and glittering brief defiance, one of the most interesting people who ever lived. Perhaps as you lie here in the quiet, breathing slowly, the day folding away behind you, you can feel the echo of that strange, electric decade, the music that changed everything, the rooms full of smoke and laughter, the streets of cities that were discovering themselves all over again. Or perhaps you are simply very comfortable now, your breathing slow and your thoughts growing soft at the edges, and the details are beginning to blur pleasantly into something less specific and more restful. That is perfectly all right. That is exactly what this was for. There is nothing else you need to do tonight, nowhere else you need to be. The story has been told, or told enough for now, and the rest can wait for whenever you feel like coming back to it. Let the images drift now, the beaded dresses, the jazz clubs, the bobbed hair swinging as she dances. Let them soften and recede like smoke rising in a quiet room, until there is nothing left but the warmth of your bed and the slow, even rhythm of your own breathing, and the perfectly ordinary miracle of another day ending in rest. Thank you for spending this quiet time with Drowsy History. Wherever you are listening from, whatever time it is there, I hope the words have helped carry you gently towards sleep. Drop a soft comment when you wake and let me know where you drifted off. Somewhere on the dance floor, maybe, or somewhere between the speakeasy and the morning after. Until the next quiet evening, rest well, breathe slowly, and let sleep come naturally, exactly as it should.